A woman on the run, a silent cowboy with a deadly past, a forced marriage in the middle of a frozen land. But when danger rises, secrets unravel, and a child becomes the center of it all. The real question isn't who they are, it's what they're willing to protect. Family isn't about blood, it's about who stands beside you when everything falls apart. Here, we tell powerful Wild West stories of cowboys, love, motherhood, sacrifice, and humanity at its rawest. Follow the journey. Like, comment, share, and subscribe for more stories like this.
The Wyoming wind didn't just blow, it bit. It carried the bitter scent of coal dust and frost, slicing through Clara Higgins's threadbare wool coat the moment her booted foot touched the wooden platform of Ridge Creek. She shivered, but the tremor running through her hands had little to do with the November cold. With practiced desperation, she gathered the excessive folds of her coat, pulling them tight across her chest while leaving the fabric loose around her middle. 3 months. The subtle rounding of her belly was still hidden beneath the heavy wool and layered petticoats. But every time the wind gusted, Clara prayed to a god she hadn't spoken to in years that the fabric wouldn't betray her. "Mama, my hands hurt," 5-year-old Sam whimpered, his small fingers clinging to her skirt. "I know, sweetie. Keep them in your pockets," Clara murmured, her breath pluming in the icy air. Beside him, 9-year-old Liam stood rigid, carrying their single battered carpet bag with a scowl that looked too old for his face. He was trying to be the man of the house, a house they no longer had. Clara lifted her chin, her eyes scanning the desolate train platform. She was looking for a savior, but the man leaning against the station master's office looked more like an executioner. Silas Vance was a mountain of a man, carved from the same unforgiving granite that loomed over the valley. He wore a heavy canvas duster and a Stetson pulled low, but it couldn't hide the jagged scar that slashed through his dark, untamed beard along his jawline. He didn't pace. He didn't check a pocket watch. He simply stood with a stillness that made Clara's chest tight. When his storm-gray eyes locked onto hers, Clara stopped breathing. "Please," she thought, her hand instinctively brushing her stomach. "Please don't look too closely." He pushed off the wall and closed the distance between them. He moved with a heavy, deliberate grace, his boots thudding against the planks. Up close, he smelled of leather, pine scrub, and a deep, ingrained solitude. "Mrs. Higgins." His voice was gravel grinding against stone. It sounded as though he hadn't used it in months. "Mr. Vance," Clara replied, forcing her chin up. She refused to cower. She'd done enough cowering in Chicago to last a lifetime. "These are my sons, Liam and Sam." Silas stared at the boys. His jaw tightened, a muscle feathering beneath his beard. For a terrifying second, Clara thought he might turn around and leave them there. Instead, he reached out and took the heavy carpet bag from Liam's straining grip without a single word. "Magistrate's office is across the street," Silas said. He turned his back and started walking. That was it. No welcome. No polite inquiries about her harrowing 4-day journey. Just a march toward a legally binding contract of survival. The wedding took less than 10 minutes. The magistrate, a balding man with ink-stained fingers, rushed through the vows as if the very presence of Silas Vance made the air in the room too thin to breathe. "Do you, Silas, take this woman?" "I do." "Do you, Clara?" "I do." It was a transaction. A roof and food for her children in exchange for housekeeping and the warming of a cowboy's bed. Clara shoved down the bile rising in her throat. She had made her choice. As they stepped back out onto the dirt street, Clara caught the sharp whispers of 2 women standing outside the mercantile. "Look at her," a woman in a velvet-trimmed bonnet hissed to her companion, not bothering to lower her voice. "Must be truly desperate to tie herself to the Ridge Creek ghost." "Give it till winter sets in," the other muttered, her eyes tracking Silas with morbid fascination. He'll drive her mad with that silence. Or worse, leave her to freeze like he did his last family. Clara stiffened. She glanced at Silas. But if he heard the venomous words, His stoic profile gave nothing away. He simply untied a pair of sturdy draft horses hitched to a weathered buckboard wagon. "Climb up," he instructed. The ride to the Valley Ranch took 2 hours, and Silas didn't speak a single word. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was a physical weight, pressing down on Clara until her ears rang. The landscape was breathtakingly bleak, endless expanses of pale sagebrush giving way to jagged, snow-capped peaks that pierced the leaden sky. When the wagon finally rumbled to a halt, Clara looked at her new home. It was a sturdy, rough-hewn log cabin, flanked by a modest corral and a large weathered barn. Attached to the barn was a smaller shed, locked tight with a heavy iron padlock. "Go inside," Silas said, helping the boys down from the wagon bed. His large hands gripped Sam under the arms, lifting the boy effortlessly before setting him in the dirt. He didn't offer his hand to Clara. She climbed down on her own, her joints aching. Inside, the cabin was Spartan but immaculately clean. A single iron stove dominated the center, radiating a faint, residual heat. There was a rough-hewn table, 3 mismatched chairs, and in the corner, a large bed covered with a thick wolf pelt blanket. Clara set her bonnet on the table, her heart hammering against her ribs. Night was falling fast. The boys were exhausted, huddled near the stove. It was time. She braced herself for the reality of her marriage contract. The door opened, letting in a swirl of snow. Silas stepped inside, carrying their carpet bag. He set it at the foot of the bed. Then he walked to a wooden chest, pulled out a thick canvas bedroll, and slung it over his broad shoulder. Clara frowned, her hands trembling. "Mr. Vance, Silas, what are you doing?" He paused, his hand on the iron doorknob. His gray eyes met hers, and for a fraction of a second the impenetrable wall of his gaze flickered with something that looked like profound exhaustion. "The bed is yours and the boys." His voice was low, barely carrying over the wind outside. "But where will you sleep?" "The barn." Before she could argue, he stepped out into the freezing night and pulled the door shut behind him. Clara stood frozen in the center of the room. Relief washed over her, so potent it made her knees weak, but it was quickly chased by a chilling confusion. She had prepared herself for a brute. She hadn't prepared herself for a ghost who gave up his own bed in the dead of winter. Hours later, after feeding the boys some dried biscuits and tucking them under the heavy pelt, Clara lay awake. The wind howled, rattling the window panes. Unable to sleep, she slipped out of bed, wrapping her coat tight around her hidden belly, and walked to the frosted glass. She wiped a circle of condensation away with her palm and peered out into the dark property. The barn was completely black. But next to it, the heavy iron padlock on the shed had been removed. A thin slice of golden light spilled from beneath the shed's door, cutting a line across the blinding white snow. Over the shriek of the Wyoming wind, Clara heard it. A steady, rhythmic shh, shh, shh. The sound of a heavy iron wood plane shaving down timber. Clara pressed her hand against the freezing glass. Why was her new husband locking himself in a shed in the dead of night, working wood in the freezing cold? And more importantly, what on earth was he building? Morning in the valley arrived not with a gentle sunrise, but with a harsh, blinding glare reflecting off the snowpack. Clara woke with a sharp ache in her lower back. She instinctively reached for the thick wolf pelt blanket, only to realize the cabin was surprisingly warm. The iron stove in the center of the room was radiating a steady, comforting heat, the fire already stoked and crackling. She sat up, pulling her heavy woolen shawl tightly around her torso. Through the small, frost-rimmed window, she could see Silas. He was already out in the corral, his breath pluming in the freezing air, working a restless Mustang. Clara dressed quickly, helping Liam and Sam into their worn clothes. When she stepped out onto the porch to fetch firewood, she stopped short. A neatly stacked pile of split pine sat right beside the door. It wasn't just chopped. It was cut to the exact length of the stove's firebox, and stacked precisely high enough that she wouldn't have to bend over or strain her stomach to reach it. She stared at the wood, a strange lump forming in her throat. Her late husband in Chicago had never once lifted a finger to ease her burdens. Silas Vance hadn't spoken a single word to her this morning, yet he had anticipated her exact needs. The days quickly settled into a quiet, fragile routine. Clara imposed order on the dusty cabin, her hands constantly busy with mending, scrubbing, and cooking. Silas remained a phantom in his own home. He ate his meals quickly, his storm-gray eyes rarely lifting from his plate, before returning to the grueling labor of the ranch. At night, he retreated to the barn, and Clara would lie awake listening to the relentless shh of the wood plane from the locked shed. Despite his silence, the boys were drawn to him. Clara watched from the kitchen window one afternoon as Silas worked the Mustang. He didn't use a whip. He didn't shout. He stood in the center of the corral with a terrifying, patient stillness, letting the wild horse exhaust itself until it finally approached him, nuzzling his outstretched hand. Liam, standing by the fence, watched with wide, hero-worshipping eyes. Even little Sam seemed to sense the quiet safety the massive cowboy radiated. When Clara went to wake Sam the next morning, she found his worn-out, hole-riddled boots sitting on the hearth. Someone had spent the night carefully resoling them with thick, waterproof leather. But Clara's domestic sanctuary was a house of cards, and her body was the wind threatening to blow it down. It hit her on their fifth morning, a wave of nausea so violent it blurred her vision. Clara bolted from the stove, a hand clamped over her mouth. She threw the back door open and stumbled behind the cabin, dropping to her knees in the freezing snow. She retched until her ribs ached, her arms wrapped protectively around her thickening middle. Tears pricked her eyes. "Not yet," she begged silently. "He can't know yet. If he throws us out now, we'll freeze to death." She stayed in the snow for several long minutes, taking deep, shuddering breaths of the icy air until her stomach finally settled. Wiping her mouth with the back of her trembling hand, she pushed herself up and smoothed her heavy coat, praying her face wasn't as pale as she felt. She walked carefully toward the water pump to wash her face. As she rounded the corner of the cabin, she froze. Silas was walking away toward the barn, his broad back turned to her. He didn't look back. But there, resting on the flat stone edge of the well, was a battered tin cup. Clara approached it slowly. A wisp of steam curled into the freezing air. She picked it up, wrapping her cold hands around the heated metal. The sharp, soothing scent of steeped ginger root and wild mint drifted up to her nose. Clara stared at the retreating figure of her silent husband, the warm cup trembling in her hands. Did he guess? Or was he just a man who noticed everything? A week later, Silas hitched the draft horses to the wagon. It was time for the monthly supply run into Ridge Creek. Clara dreaded returning to the town, but they were perilously low on flour and salt. She bundled the boys into the wagon bed, wrapping them in blankets, and took her seat beside Silas. The ride was as silent as the day they met, but the silence had shifted. It no longer felt suffocating. It felt watchful. When they arrived in Ridge Creek, Silas pulled the wagon up to the feed store to load grain. "Go to the mercantile," he rasped, handing her a small leather coin purse. "I'll be there in 10 minutes. Clara took the boys' hands and walked into the crowded general store. The bell above the door chimed, and almost immediately the chatter inside died down. Margaret, the mercantile owner with a face like pinched leather, was organizing bolts of fabric with another townswoman. They didn't bother lowering their voices as Clara began gathering bags of flour and coffee beans. "Thought she'd have run off by now," the townswoman murmured, eyeing Clara's frayed hem. "Where would she go?" Margaret scoffed, aggressively folding a piece of calico. "She chained herself to a dead man walking. You know what they say. Every winter, Silas Vance loses a little more of his mind, thinking about what he left up on Medicine Bow." Clara's hand tightened on a tin of baking powder. "Buried his own wife and baby girl in the snow," Margaret continued, her voice dripping with cruel relish. left them in that mountain cabin, and walked away. A real man would have brought his family down the mountain, blizzard or no blizzard. Now he just haunts that valley, paying penance. A sick, cold feeling washed over Clara. A baby girl. She instinctively pressed a hand to her own stomach beneath her coat. Before Margaret could say another word, the light from the doorway was blocked out. Silas stood on the threshold. He didn't yell. He didn't draw the Colt strapped to his thigh. He simply let his storm-gray eyes sweep over Margaret and the gossiping woman. The silence he brought with him was so heavy, so dense with unspoken violence, that Margaret physically took a step back, her face draining of color. "Put it on my tab," Silas said to the pale clerk at the counter, taking Clara's supplies. But before they could turn to leave, a man stepped out from the back office of the Mercantile. He wore a tailored wool suit, an expensive bowler hat, and a smile that didn't reach his flat, reptilian eyes. "Mr. Vance, what spectacular timing," the man said, smoothing his lapels. Silas's posture changed instantly. The protective stillness vanished, replaced by the coiled tension of a rattlesnake about to strike. Thaddeus Thorne stepped forward, tossing a thick stack of legal papers onto the wooden counter. It landed with a heavy, final thud. "I've just come from the land office in Cheyenne," Thorne said, his voice smooth and dripping with mock sympathy. "Filed under the 1872 Mining Act. That mountain ridge up on Medicine Bow? The one you abandoned 8 years ago? It belongs to my mining conglomerate now. We'll be bringing the timber crews up by spring to clear out whatever ruins are left standing." Clara gasped. Margaret's gossip echoed in her ears. That's where his wife and baby are buried. Silas didn't blink, but Clara saw his large hand twitch, drifting a fraction of an inch closer to the grip of his revolver. "You step foot in that valley, Thorne, and I'll bury you in it." Silas's voice was barely a whisper, but it carried the chilling promise of death. Thorne chuckled, tapping the legal papers. "It's the law, Vance. You can't shoot the law. In fact, my surveyors tell me the silver veins might run all the way down into your valley ranch. I'd consider selling now, before you find yourself losing another family to the cold." Silas moved so fast, Clara barely registered it. He grabbed Thorne by the lapels of his expensive suit, slamming him back against the counter. Glass jars rattled and fell, shattering on the floor. "Silas, no!" Clara cried out, grabbing his arm. "He wants you to do this! He wants you in a cell!" Silas breathed heavily, his face inches from Thorne's smug, terrified expression. Slowly, Silas released him, shoving him away in disgust. He grabbed Clara's arm, herded the boys out the door, and practically threw them into the wagon. The ride home was terrifying. Silas drove the horses hard, his jaw locked, his eyes fixed on the darkening horizon. That night, Clara put the boys to bed early. The air in the cabin was thick with tension. She sat by the window, watching the barn, waiting for the familiar sound of the wood plane. But tonight, there was only silence. Around midnight, Clara finally drifted into a restless sleep, only to be jolted awake by a horrific sound. The frantic, terrified screaming of horses. Clara sat up. The cabin was glowing with an unnatural, flickering orange light. She rushed to the window and screamed. The barn was on fire. Flames licked up the dry wooden siding, sending thick plumes of black smoke into the starless winter sky. "Silas!" she shrieked, running for the door. But Silas was already out there. He had kicked the barn doors open and was dragging the panicked draft horses out into the snow, his duster smoking from the heat. Clara grabbed a bucket from the well, pumping water with frantic, adrenaline-fueled strength. Together they fought the blaze for an hour, shoveling snow and throwing water until the flames finally hissed and died, leaving one side of the barn a charred, smoldering ruin. Clara dropped her bucket, her lungs burning, coughing on the thick smoke. She looked at the snow near the barn's edge. Footprints, boot tracks leading away into the brush, accompanied by the distinct smell of kerosene. Thorne's men. Silas stood in the center of the blackened snow, chest heaving, his face covered in soot and ash. He didn't look at the ruined barn. He was staring at the cabin, at Clara, and the two little faces pressed against the window pane. Slowly, Silas walked past Clara. He stepped into the cabin, his boots leaving black, ashen prints on the floorboards. He walked straight to the stone mantel and pulled down his Winchester rifle, racking a shell into the chamber with a sharp, metallic clack. He turned to Clara, his gray eyes blazing with a cold, terrifying light. "Pack your things," Silas rasped, his knuckles white around the rifle. "Pack warm. We're going up the mountain." They left the valley while the ashes of the barn were still smoking, swallowed by the pre-dawn dark. Silas packed the wagon with ruthless efficiency: flour, salted pork, blankets, rifles, and every round of ammunition he owned. He hitched the draft horses, lifting Liam and Sam into the back beneath a heavy canvas tarp. When he turned to Clara, he didn't speak. He simply hoisted her onto the bench seat, his large hands gripping her waist with a careful, bruising intensity, before taking the reins. The journey up the Medicine Bow Mountains was a slow, agonizing ascent into a frozen purgatory. By noon, the wagon wheels were grinding against ice and jagged scree. The trail, abandoned for 8 years, was barely a scar on the sheer mountainside. Pine trees closed in around them like the bars of a cage, and the wind began to howl through the timberline, a high, lonely sound that made the boys huddle deeper beneath the canvas. For Clara, the trek was a physical nightmare. The constant, violent jolting of the wagon sent sharp, terrifying cramps shooting across her lower abdomen. She gripped the edge of the wooden bench until her knuckles turned white, her teeth biting into her bottom lip to keep from crying out. "Hold on," she prayed, pressing her forearms subtly against her heavy wool coat. "Please, God, hold on." She had lost a baby before Liam was born, back in the filthy slums of Chicago. She knew the metallic taste of that specific hollow terror. Silas drove the team relentlessly, his eyes scanning the tree line for any sign of Thorne's men. But he missed nothing. Out of the corner of his eye, he caught the rigid set of Clara's shoulders, the pale, bloodless line of her lips. He pulled back on the reins. Whoa. The horses halted, their breath pluming in thick white clouds. Silas wrapped the leather lines around the brake lever and jumped down into the knee-deep snow. He walked around to Clara's side, reaching up. "I'm fine," she gasped, though her voice shook. "We need to keep moving." "You're white as chalk," Silas rasped. He didn't ask for permission. He pulled her down from the bench, his massive arms taking her entire weight for a breathless second before setting her feet in the snow. "Walk. Stretch your legs. Get the blood moving." Clara leaned against the wagon wheel, squeezing her eyes shut, as another cramp seized her. When she opened them, Silas was standing inches away, blocking the biting wind with his broad body. He reached into his coat, pulled out a small leather flask, and pressed it into her trembling hands. "Willow bark tea," he said gruffly. "Brews bitter, kills the pain." Clara stared at the flask, then up into his storm-gray eyes. He knew she was hurting. He had brewed it before they left, anticipating her pain. She took a swallow. It tasted like dirt and wet bark, but as it hit her stomach, a slow, dulling warmth began to spread through her cramping muscles. "Thank you," she whispered. Silas just gave a sharp nod and turned back to the horses. They couldn't make the summit before nightfall. The temperature plummeted with the setting sun, transforming the mountain air into something sharp enough to cut glass. Silas found a shallow cave-like overhang beneath a massive outcropping of granite. He built a fire near the entrance, creating a barrier of heat, and laid out the thickest pelts on the rocky floor. "Boys in the middle," Silas ordered, his breath a white fog in the firelight. Liam and Sam curled together, instantly exhausted, falling asleep the moment the heat of the fire touched their faces. Clara sat near the edge of the bedroll, shivering uncontrollably despite her heavy coat. The willow bark had eased the cramps, but the cold was sinking into her very bones. Silas finished tending the horses and stepped back under the overhang. He looked at the meager space left on the bedroll, then at Clara's violently shaking shoulders. He didn't hesitate. Silas sat down behind her. He unbuttoned his heavy canvas duster and wrapped it around her shoulders, pulling her back flush against his broad chest. Clara gasped at the sudden contact. He was a furnace, solid muscles smelling of wood smoke, leather, and sweat. His large arms wrapped around her waist, careful, so careful, not to press too hard against her stomach, and locked her into his warmth. "Sleep, Clara," his voice rumbled deep in his chest, vibrating against her back. It was the first time he had ever used her first name. The intimacy of it, combined with the desperate shared body heat, made Clara's heart hammer wildly. She closed her eyes, surrounded by the scent and strength of her silent husband, and for the first time since she stepped off the train in Wyoming, she felt completely, undeniably safe. Hours later, the fire popped, throwing a shower of orange sparks into the dark. Clara stirred. The space behind her was empty. She sat up, pulling the heavy duster tighter around herself. Silas was sitting cross-legged near the mouth of the overhang, a rifle resting across his knees. He was staring out into the pitch-black freezing mountain pass. He wasn't wearing his coat. His flannel shirt was woefully inadequate against the sub-zero wind, and his broad shoulders shook with silent, suppressed shivers. He had given her his coat. He had stayed awake all night, freezing, just to keep watch. Clara stared at his broad back, a profound, terrifying realization settling over her. He is going to break my heart. They reached the ridge just past noon the next day. The cabin sat in a small clearing surrounded by towering, snow-laden pines. It was a sturdy, beautifully built log structure, but it radiated an overwhelming aura of abandonment. The windows were dark, staring out at the valley like hollow eyes. Silas pulled the wagon to a halt. He didn't move to get down. He sat on the bench, his hands gripping the leather reins so tightly the thick leather creaked. He was staring at the heavy oak door. Clara could see the muscle in his jaw ticking frantically. He wasn't seeing the snow, he was seeing a blizzard from 8 years ago. He was seeing the ghosts he had left behind. Clara placed her gloved hand over his rigid knuckles. "Silas." He flinched, snapping back to the present. He looked at her, his eyes hollow, stripped of all their usual armor. "Give me the keys," Clara said softly, her voice steady and calm. "Take the boys and tend the horses. Let me go in first." Relief, raw and devastating, flickered across his face. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a heavy iron key, and dropped it into her palm. Clara walked to the door, the snow crunching beneath her boots. The key turned with a rusty shriek. She pushed the heavy door open, stepping into a cloud of trapped, freezing dust. It was a time capsule of a tragedy. The cabin was perfectly preserved in its devastation. A tin cup sat half full of frozen evaporated water on the rough-hewn table. A woman's knitted shawl was draped casually over the back of a rocking chair, as if she had just stepped away for a moment. In the corner, a small, beautifully carved wooden horse lay on its side on a braided rug. Clara stood in the center of the room, feeling the heavy, suffocating weight of Silas's past. A lesser woman might have felt jealousy toward the ghost of Martha Vance. Clara only felt a profound, aching sorrow for the man who had been forced to leave this room. She didn't erase the memory. She honored it. Moving with quiet reverence, Clara gently folded the knitted shawl. She picked up the wooden horse, dusting it off with the hem of her sleeve. She found a sturdy cedar chest at the foot of the bed, opened it, and carefully packed the items inside, making room for the living while respectfully laying the dead to rest. By the time Silas finally stepped through the door carrying their supplies, the cabin smelled of fresh pine branches and lye soap. A fire was roaring in the massive stone hearth. The ghosts had not been banished, but they had been quieted. Silas looked around the cleared room, his eyes lingering on the closed cedar chest. He looked at Clara, standing by the stove with soot on her cheek. He didn't say a word, but the profound gratitude in his eyes was louder than a shout. He immediately went to work, his grief channeled into a fierce, protective energy. He began boarding up the vulnerable rear windows with heavy planks and sorting their ammunition on the table. He was preparing for a siege. While Silas fortified the perimeter, Clara began clearing out the rest of the cedar chest to store their flour and winter clothes. Beneath a stack of old quilts, her fingers brushed against a heavy leather tube. Curiosity getting the better of her, Clara popped the brass cap and slid out a roll of brittle parchment. It was a geological survey map, meticulously drawn in faded ink, bearing the signature of Elijah Vance, Martha's father, a well-known prospector. Clara unrolled the map across the bed. It detailed the Medicine Bow Ridge, marking underground water tables and mineral deposits. Her eyes scanned the meticulously recorded coordinates at the bottom corner. She froze. Back in Chicago, Clara had kept the accounting books for her late husband's shipping business. She had a mind for numbers. When Thaddeus Thorne had slammed his legal papers onto the mercantile counter 3 days ago, she had seen the bold ink of his filed coordinates. Township 14 North, Range 78 West, Section 12. She looked at the old survey map. The massive silver vein Martha's father had discovered wasn't on Section 12. It was on Section 14, 2 miles east, deep in the public valley below. Thorne didn't have a legal claim to this ridge. His paperwork was fraudulent, intentionally filed off-center to steal Silas's land under the guise of the Mining Act, likely because he knew Silas's ridge provided the only accessible logging road to extract the silver from the valley. Thorne was a fraud, and if the government knew, his claim would be voided, and he'd hang for claim jumping. "Silas," Clara breathed, her heart hammering. But Silas was out back, the heavy thwack of his axe echoing off the pines. She needed to get this information to the authorities, but Thorne's men were surely blocking the trail back to Ridge Creek. A shadow passed the front window. Clara snatched Silas's spare revolver from the table and spun around, aiming at the door. "Hello, the cabin," a voice called out, muffled by the thick logs. "Just passing through. Mean no harm." Clara cracked the door, keeping the revolver leveled. A grizzled man in a beaver pelt hat sat atop a shaggy mule, leading a pack horse loaded with furs. He looked nervously at the barrel of her gun. "Just heading down to Cheyenne, ma'am," the trapper said, raising his hands. "Trying to beat the storm." Cheyenne, where the U.S. Marshal's office was. Clara lowered the gun. She rushed to the table, tearing a blank margin off the survey map. With a nub of lead pencil, she furiously scrawled a message to the U.S. Marshal, detailing Thorne's fraudulent coordinates, the arson, and their trapped location. She ran out onto the porch, the freezing wind whipping her skirts. She handed the folded paper to the trapper. "Please," Clara begged, "take this to the Marshal in Cheyenne. It's a matter of life and death." The trapper looked at the paper, then at her. "Cheyenne's a hard ride, lady. I ain't a courier for free." Clara didn't hesitate. She reached under the collar of her dress and unclasped a thin silver chain. Hanging from it was a small pearl-inlaid locket, the only thing she had left of her mother, the only thing of value she hadn't sold to buy train tickets west. She pressed the locket into the trapper's grimy hand. "Buy the fastest horse you can find at the bottom of the mountain. Just deliver the letter." The trapper bit the silver, nodded, and tucked the letter into his heavy coat. "Consider it done, ma'am." He spurred his mule, disappearing down the treacherous mountain switchbacks. Clara stood on the porch, her arms wrapped around her stomach, watching the empty trail. A sudden biting gust of wind hit her face. She looked up at the sky. The blue had completely vanished, replaced by a bruised leaden gray that seemed to swallow the peaks. As she watched, the first heavy, fat flakes of snow began to fall, swirling viciously in the wind. "Hurry," she thought, as the snow rapidly began to coat the ground, erasing the trapper's tracks. The blizzard had arrived, and they were entirely, terrifyingly cut off from the world. For 3 days the mountains screamed. The blizzard battered the log cabin with blinding horizontal sheets of white, burying the windows halfway up the glass. Outside, the world was a deadly, frozen void. Inside, however, the heavy cedar walls held fast, trapping the heat of the roaring stone hearth, and creating a strange, suspended pocket of peace. Clara stood by the cast-iron stove, stirring a pot of salted venison stew. She paused, letting the wooden spoon rest against the rim, and watched the scene unfolding at the rough-hewn table. Silas was sitting beside Liam. Between them lay a block of soft pine. Silas's massive, scarred hands were gently guiding Liam's small ones around the handle of a hunting knife. "Thumb here," Silas rumbled, his voice lower and softer than the howling wind outside. "Never pull the blade toward your body. Push away. Let the sharp edge do the work, not your shoulder. Liam nodded, his brow furrowed in fierce concentration. He pushed the blade, shaving off a curling ribbon of pale wood. A wide, gap-toothed smile broke across the boy's face. "I did it." "You did," Silas affirmed, a faint, rare softening at the corners of his storm-gray eyes. On the rug by the fire, little Sam was fast asleep, his head resting on the belly of Silas's heavy canvas duster, which Silas had laid out specifically for the boy. Clara pressed a hand to her chest, her heart aching with a sudden, fierce longing. This was what a father looked like, not the shouting, the raised fists, or the smell of cheap whiskey she had known in Chicago. It was patience. It was quiet protection. That night, after the boys were tucked into the large bed under a mountain of quilts, Clara and Silas sat in front of the hearth. The firelight painted the cabin in warm strokes of copper and gold. Clara sat in the rocking chair, a mending needle idle in her lap. The cabin was sweltering compared to the freezing temperatures they had endured on the trail, and she had long since discarded her heavy, suffocating wool coat. She wore only her cotton day dress, a thick woven shawl draped carefully over her shoulders and pooled in her lap to obscure her waistline. Silas sat on a wooden stool a few feet away, methodically running a whetstone over the edge of his hunting knife. Sh sh sh. The rhythmic sound was hypnotic. He stopped suddenly. He didn't look up at her face. His eyes were fixed on her hands, trembling slightly where they gripped the shawl. "You're tired," he said quietly. "I'm just thinking," Clara replied, her voice barely a whisper above the crackling logs, "about what happens when the storm breaks." Silas set the knife and whetstone down on the hearth. He stood up, his towering frame casting a long shadow across the floorboards and closed the distance between them. He knelt in front of her rocking chair, bringing his face level with hers. "When the storm breaks, the marshal will be waiting," Silas said, his gaze dropping to her lips before meeting her eyes again. "Thorn is done. You don't have to look over your shoulder anymore." "It's not Thorn I'm worried about," Clara breathed. Silas reached out. His knuckles, scarred and calloused, brushed gently against her cheek. Clara's breath hitched. She leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering shut. He didn't hesitate anymore. Silas leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers. It wasn't a demanding kiss, but it was devastatingly absolute. It tasted of chicory coffee and the wild, raw energy of the mountain. Clara let out a soft, fractured sigh, her hands coming up to grip the lapels of his flannel shirt. The kiss deepened, a desperate, unspoken confession of the terror they had survived and the profound yearning they had been denying. The heat of the fire and the rush of her own blood made Clara feel dizzy. She shifted forward in the chair, pulling him closer. As she moved, the heavy woven shawl slipped off her shoulders, pooling on the floor. Silas pulled back slowly, his breathing ragged, his eyes dark with desire. He looked at her flushed face, then his gaze traveled downward. Clara froze. She was sitting upright, her cotton dress pulling taut across her midsection. The firelight threw her profile into sharp, undeniable relief. The rounded swell of her stomach, 4 months along and no longer hidden by thick coats or draped shawls, was completely exposed. The air in the cabin seemed to instantly evaporate. Silas didn't blink. He stared at her stomach, his face draining of all color. The warmth in his eyes vanished, replaced by an expression so blank, so utterly unreadable, that it terrified her more than anger would have. Slowly, deliberately, his gaze dragged back up to her face. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Silas!" she choked out, instinctively crossing her arms over her belly. He stood up. He didn't say a word. He didn't yell or curse or ask who the father was. He simply turned his back on her, picked up his knife from the hearth, and walked to the farthest, darkest corner of the cabin. He sat down in the shadows, his back to the wall, and began running the whetstone over the blade again. Sk, sk, sk. Fast, rhythmic, cold. Clara sat in the rocking chair, the silence crushing the breath out of her lungs. knowing with absolute sickening certainty that she had just lost everything. Midnight came, but sleep did not. Clara lay rigid on the edge of the bed, staring at the dark timber ceiling. The wind was still shrieking outside, but the blizzard had finally begun to slow. By morning, the snow would stop. By morning, Silas would tell her to leave. Her mind raced, poisoned by the trauma of her past and the brutal realities of the West. He won't raise another man's bastard. The thought looped in her head, loud and damning. She remembered the cruel gossip from the mercantile. He left them to freeze. Clara knew logically that Silas was a good man. But maternal panic is not logical. It is a primal, blinding instinct. If he cast her out in the morning without a horse, without supplies, she and her boys would die on the mountain. She couldn't wait for him to pass judgment. She had to strike first. She had to take a horse and run for Ridge Creek, while she still had the element of surprise. She slipped out from under the quilts, her stockinged feet making no sound on the floorboards. She pulled her heavy wool coat back on, buttoning it tight to her throat. Silas was asleep on his bedroll near the front door, his broad chest rising and falling evenly, his rifle resting within an inch of his fingertips. Clara moved like a ghost. She gently shook Liam awake, covering his mouth with her hand. "Shh," she breathed into his ear. "We're playing a game. Wake your brother. Don't make a sound. Put your coats on." Liam's eyes were wide with confusion. But he was a child who had learned to obey whispered, terrified commands back in Chicago. He silently roused Sam, helping the sleepy 5-year-old into his boots. The front door was too risky. It was heavy, creaked loudly, and Silas was right next to it. But there was a side door in the kitchen area that led directly into the attached lean-to shed, where Silas had sheltered the horses from the storm. Clara gripped the iron latch of the side door. She pressed the lever down millimeter by agonizing millimeter. It clicked softly. She pushed the door open, ushering the boys into the freezing, pitch-black shed. The smell of wet horsehair, manure, and fresh sawdust hit her instantly. The horses shifted in the dark, their hooves thudding softly in the dirt. "Stay right here against the wall," Clara whispered to the boys. "Don't move." She fumbled blindly in the dark, her hands trailing along the rough wooden walls, searching for the leather bridles and a saddle. Her fingers brushed against a cold metal lantern hanging on a nail. Beside it, a box of matches. Clara struck a match, the sudden flare momentarily blinding her. She lit the lantern, keeping the wick turned down low so the light wouldn't bleed under the door into the cabin. A dim yellow glow washed over the shed. Clara turned toward the tack wall, but her boot caught on something heavy on the floor. She stumbled forward, dropping the lantern. It hit the dirt with a dull thud, remaining upright, its weak light spilling across a large object covered by a heavy canvas tarp. Clara caught her balance, her heart racing. The tarp had snagged on her boot and pulled halfway down. She froze. It wasn't a stash of weapons. It wasn't a coffin. Sitting in the center of the sawdust-covered floor, glowing golden in the lantern light, was a wooden cradle. Clara dropped to her knees in the dirt. Her trembling hands reached out, pulling the rest of the canvas tarp away. It was a masterpiece. Carved from solid, pale oak, the wood had been sanded so smooth it looked like glass. But it was the intricate carvings along the side panels that stole the breath from Clara's lungs. Along the top rail, a herd of wild mustangs was carved in mid-gallop, their manes flying in a frozen wind. Horses for Liam and Sam. And curving along the baseboard, framing the entire cradle, was a delicate, sprawling vine of blooming daisies, her favorite flower. She had mentioned it exactly once, weeks ago, while washing dishes at the Valley Ranch. He hadn't been locking himself in the shed to hide from her. He hadn't been preparing for war. Every night, while she slept, the silent cowboy had been painstakingly carving a place for her unborn child. Clara touched a wooden daisy, a hot tear slipping down her cheek and landing on the oak. "I was wondering when you'd find it," Clara gasped, spinning around. Silas was standing in the doorway, connecting the cabin to the shed. He held no rifle. His storm-gray eyes were fixed on her, bright and devastated in the dim light. "I measured the oak the second day you were here," Silas said, his voice breaking, gravel and raw emotion. "I saw you sick behind the cabin. I knew." Clara sobbed, a hand flying to her mouth. "You knew? And you didn't say anything?" "I was waiting for you to trust me." Silas stepped into the shed, his large frame filling the space. He looked at the boys huddled against the wall, then down at the saddlebags Clara had dropped. "Where were you taking my family, Clara?" The words hung in the freezing, sawdust-scented air of the shed, heavier than the suffocating Wyoming blizzard raging outside. Clara remained on her knees in the dirt, the heavy canvas tarp pooled around her skirts. Her hand was still resting on the smooth, polished oak rail of the cradle, her fingers trembling against the meticulously carved daisies. She couldn't breathe. Her lungs refused to expand. She stared at the towering silhouette of Silas Vance framed in the doorway, the weak, flickering yellow light of the lantern casting long, distorted shadows across the brutal scars of his face. "I?" Clara choked, a violent sob tearing up her throat. The lie she had carefully constructed, the desperate survival instinct that had driven her out of bed and into the freezing dark, completely shattered against the sheer, devastating weight of what she had just uncovered. She looked back down at the cradle. It wasn't just a piece of furniture. It was hundreds of hours of painstaking, meticulous labor. The oak had been sanded down so flawlessly it felt like silk beneath her calloused fingertips. The herd of wild mustangs carved along the top rail were breathtaking in their detail, manes flying, hooves kicking up phantom dust. It was a masterpiece born of agonizing patience and profound, unspoken devotion. "You knew," Clara whispered, her voice cracking as she looked back up at him. Tears spilled over her lower lashes, cutting hot, wet tracks down her freezing cheeks. "Since the second day in the valley, the morning sickness behind the cabin, the ginger tea." Silas didn't move. His storm-gray eyes were locked onto her face, raw and glistening in the dim light. "I saw you shivering in the snow. I saw the way you held your stomach. A man who's watched his wife carry a child doesn't forget what that protective instinct looks like, Clara." "Then why didn't you say anything?" Clara cried out, the trauma of her past rising up in a wave of hysterical panic. She scrambled to her feet, placing herself between Silas and her two terrified boys huddled against the rough timber wall. Liam was clutching Sam's hand, his small chest heaving. "Why let me carry this secret? Why let me live in terror every single day, wondering when you were going to notice my waistline thickening? Wondering what morning I was going to wake up and find my belongings tossed out in the snow because you didn't want another man's bastard?" The word bastard struck Silas like a physical blow. He flinched, his broad shoulders jerking as if he had taken a bullet to the chest. Slowly, deliberately, he stepped fully into the freezing shed. The heavy cabin door clicked shut behind him, sealing them in the dim, lantern-lit space. He walked toward her, his heavy boots crushing the scattered wood shavings into the dirt. Clara shrank back, her breath hitching. She had been married to a man in Chicago who used his fists to win arguments. Her body braced for impact. But Silas didn't raise his hands, he didn't yell. Instead, the giant scarred cowboy, the man the town of Ridge Creek called a ghost, a monster, a madman, dropped heavily to his knees right there in the sawdust and dirt directly in front of her. Clara gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. Silas looked up at her, his neck craning, completely surrendering his formidable height and strength. The flickering light caught the wet sheen in his eyes. He reached out, his massive, calloused hands trembling violently, and gently wrapped his fingers around her wrists. He didn't pull her down. He simply held on to her, as if she were the only solid thing left in a crumbling world. "Because I was terrified," Silas rasped, his voice grinding with the agonizing effort of forcing the words past his throat. "I was terrified that if I spoke it aloud, you would think I was demanding something from you. I was terrified that if I acknowledged the child, you would bolt, thinking I was trying to replace the family I failed to keep alive. Clara stared down at him, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. "You thought I would run?" "I am a silent, scarred man who lives with ghosts, Clara," Silas said, a single tear breaking free and tracking down his weathered cheek into his dark beard. "I know what I am. I know what the town says about me. When you stepped off that train, you looked like a bird trapped in a cage, ready to snap her own wings just to get out. You married me to survive, I knew that. But I also knew—" He swallowed hard, his grip tightening marginally on her wrists. "I knew within a week that I would burn down the whole damn territory before I let anyone hurt you or those boys." He let go of her wrists and slowly, reverently, reached out to touch the smooth oak railing of the cradle beside him. "When my Martha and the baby died," Silas whispered, his voice dropping to a hollow, haunted frequency that made the hair on the back of Clara's neck stand up. "I took my carving knives and I buried them in the frozen earth behind this cabin. I swore to God I would never create another thing as long as I lived. Because what was the point? Wood rots. People die. The mountain takes everything you love." Clara dropped to her knees in the sawdust, mirroring his position. She didn't care about the cold or the dirt. She reached out, placing her hands over his where they rested on the carved daisies. Silas looked at their joined hands, then up into her eyes. "Then you came. You and your boys. You filled my empty cabin with noise, with the smell of baking bread and the sound of children laughing. You didn't ask me to stop grieving. You just existed alongside my grief until it started to shrink." He took a deep, shuddering breath. "When I realized you were carrying a child, I went out to the barn and I sat in the dark for hours. I wasn't angry, Clara. I was overwhelmed. The thought of a baby, a new, fragile life in my house again. It terrified me so badly my hands wouldn't stop shaking. But then I remembered the way you looked at Liam and Sam, the fierce, absolute way you protected them. And I realized that this baby wasn't a ghost. It was a miracle, a second chance I didn't deserve." "Silas?" Clara sobbed, her defenses completely obliterated by the sheer, devastating beauty of his confession. "I bought the oak the next day in town," Silas continued, his thumb gently tracing the back of her trembling hand. "I snuck out to the shed every night because I didn't have the words to tell you how I felt. I couldn't speak it, so I decided to build it. I carved the Mustangs because I saw how Liam looked at the horses in the corral, how he wanted to be brave. I carved the daisies because you told me once they reminded you of a sunnier place. I built this to show you that there is a place for this child here, that there is a place for you here. Always." Clara threw her arms around his thick neck, burying her face in the collar of his flannel shirt. She cried with the sheer, agonizing relief of a woman who had been running for her life and had finally, miraculously found a wall she could rest against. Silas wrapped his massive arms around her, crushing her to his chest. He buried his face in her hair, his own shoulders shaking with silent, heaving sobs. It was the breaking of an 8-year dam. The ice that had encased the Ridge Creek ghost was finally, permanently shattering. "He beat me," Clara whispered into his shoulder, the dark truth of her past spilling out into the safety of his embrace. "The baby's father. He beat me, and he drank. And when he died in a brawl in the alleys of Chicago, I had nothing left but debts and bruises. I was so scared, Silas. I thought when you saw my belly growing, you'd see another man's claim on me. I thought you'd look at me with disgust." Silas pulled back just enough to look her dead in the eye. His expression hardened, not with anger directed at her, but with a fierce, lethal protectiveness that made the air in the shed crackle. "That man is rotting in the ground, Clara," Silas stated, his voice ringing with absolute, unshakable authority. "He gave you nothing but pain. He has no claim here. This child—" Silas slowly lowered his hand, resting his large, warm palm gently against the swell of her stomach through her heavy wool coat. At that exact moment, as if summoned by his touch, The baby shifted. It was a sharp, distinct flutter right against Silas's palm. Silas gasped, his eyes going wide as saucers. He froze, completely paralyzed by the sensation of the tiny life moving beneath his hand. The hardened, deadly cowboy looked down at her stomach with an expression of such pure, unadulterated awe that Clara felt her heart might physically burst. "Did you feel that?" Silas breathed, his voice barely a whisper. "I felt it," Clara smiled through her tears, covering his hand with her own, pressing it closer to her belly. "This child," Silas repeated, his voice thickening with fresh emotion, his gaze lifting to meet hers with a blazing, unbreakable vow, "is a Vance. It is my child, just like Liam, just like Sam. You are my wife, Clara, and I will die before I let the cold, or the mountain, or Thaddeus Thorne touch a single hair on any of your heads." A quiet rustle in the sawdust drew their attention. Liam and Sam had crept away from the wall. They stood a few feet away, watching the two adults with wide, uncertain eyes. Liam's lower lip was trembling. We're not running away?" the 9-year-old asked, his voice small and scared. Silas let go of Clara and opened his other arm. "No, son," he said firmly. "We're not running anywhere. Come here." The boys didn't hesitate. They practically threw themselves across the dirt floor, piling into Silas and Clara's embrace. Silas gathered them all in, his massive arms encompassing Clara, the baby in her womb, and the two boys in one tight, impenetrable circle of warmth. For a long, beautiful moment, the freezing shed felt like the safest place on earth. The wind howled outside, beating fruitlessly against the heavy timber walls. But inside, the ghosts had finally been laid to rest. The cradle sat beside them, glowing in the lantern light, an empty vessel waiting to be filled with the promise of tomorrow. Clara rested her head against Silas's chest, listening to the steady, strong thud of his heart. She had married a stranger to survive, but she had found a soulmate. She closed her eyes, a profound peace settling over her tired bones. Then, the wind changed. It wasn't a gradual shift. It was a sudden, unnatural dip in the howling gale, a momentary lull in the blizzard's fury that left a strange, echoing vacuum of silence in its wake. In that split second of quiet, Clara heard it. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Heavy boots compressing the deep snow just inches away from the thin exterior wall of the shed. Silas's body went rigidly tense beneath her. The tender, weeping husband vanished in a fraction of a heartbeat, instantly replaced by the lethal, coiled predator of the frontier. His gray eyes snapped wide open, locking onto the far wall of the shed. "Silas?" Clara whispered, feeling the sudden, terrifying shift in his energy. "Get down," Silas hissed, his voice dropping to a deadly, gravelly register. He shoved Clara and the boys flat into the sawdust, throwing his own massive body over them like a human shield. Crack! Boom! The deafening roar of a high-caliber rifle tore through the night. A heavy lead bullet punched straight through the wooden siding of the shed, splintering the timber into jagged shrapnel. The slug ripped through the freezing air exactly where Clara's head had been a second before, slamming into the metal casing of the lantern hanging on the wall. Glass shattered into 1,000 glittering, deadly pieces. Kerosene splashed against the timber, but thankfully the sudden violent impact snuffed the wick out before the fuel could ignite. The shed was instantly plunged into pitch-black, suffocating darkness. Outside, a voice rose over the returning howl of the wind, a cruel, mocking shout that cut through the blizzard like a serrated blade. "Hello, the cabin!" Thaddeus Thorne yelled, his voice echoing eerily off the mountain ridges. "I told you I was coming for this land, Vance, and I brought the deed with me." More footsteps crunched in the snow. The ominous metallic clack-clack of lever-action rifles being chambered echoed from 3 different directions. They were surrounded. In the pitch black of the shed, Clara felt Silas move off of her. His hand found her face in the dark, his thumb swiping roughly across her cheek to wipe away a lingering tear. "Stay on the floor." "Keep the boys behind the water trough," Silas ordered, his voice devoid of all fear, replaced entirely by a cold, calculating rage. "Silas," Clara grabbed his sleeve in the dark, her fingers shaking. "There are too many of them." She felt the heavy, calloused warmth of his hand cover hers, squeezing once with reassuring, bone-crushing strength. "This is my mountain, Clara," Silas whispered into the dark, the metallic snick of him drawing his heavy Colt revolver sounding impossibly loud in the small space. "And no one takes my family from me twice." He pulled away, his boots moving silently through the sawdust as he headed for the doorway leading back into the fortified cabin. The siege had begun. Silas hauled Clara and the boys out of the freezing shed and into the fortified main cabin just as a second volley of gunfire erupted. Lead slugs tore through the heavy oak door, splintering the wood and thudding violently into the ceiling beams. Silas kicked the iron deadbolt into place and shoved a massive wooden crossbar over the brackets. "Get to the hearth," Silas barked over the deafening roar of the rifles. Clara dragged Liam and Sam toward the massive stone fireplace, the only structure in the cabin thick enough to stop a high-caliber bullet. She threw a heavy wolf pelt blanket over the trembling boys, shielding them from the flying splinters and shattered glass raining down as Thorne's men shot out the front windows. "Stay flat," Clara ordered, her voice remarkably steady despite the terror clawing at her throat. "Do not move until I tell you." Silas was already moving with lethal, terrifying precision. He kicked over the heavy dining table, creating a barricade near the shattered front window. He rested the barrel of his Winchester rifle on the overturned edge. His storm-gray eyes narrowed into slits against the howling wind and swirling snow pouring through the broken glass. He didn't fire blindly, he waited. A muzzle flash illuminated the tree line. Silas squeezed the trigger. Crack! A man screamed in the dark, and the incoming fire from the left flank instantly ceased. "One down," Silas muttered, rapidly working the lever action of the rifle. Hot brass spun through the air, clinking against the floorboards. Clara crawled on her hands and knees toward the overturned table. She grabbed Silas's spare rifle from the floor and the heavy canvas bag of ammunition. "What are you doing?" Silas yelled over the wind, not taking his eyes off the dark tree line. "Get back to the hearth." "You shoot, I load," Clara shouted back, her hands shaking but her resolve absolute. She shoved a fresh shell into the loading gate of the spare rifle, her thumb bruised and cold. "I'm not letting you fight them alone." Before Silas could argue, a blinding, white-hot agony ripped through Clara's abdomen. It wasn't a cramp. It was a violent downward shear of pain that stole the oxygen from her lungs. She dropped the rifle, her hands flying to her stomach, and let out a strangled cry. At the exact same moment, she felt a sudden warm gush of fluid soak through her thick wool skirts, pooling onto the cold floorboards. Silas snapped his head around, his eyes dropping to the dark stain spreading beneath her knees. The color drained from his face. The battle outside seemed to momentarily vanish, replaced by the terrifying ghost of the past. 8 years ago, the blizzard, the blood, the silence. "Clara," Silas breathed, his hands leaving the rifle. "No!" Clara grabbed his forearm, her nails digging into his thick flannel shirt. The pain was receding into a dull roar, leaving her gasping but lucid. She could not let him freeze. Not now. "Silas, look at me. I am not Martha, I am not dying, but the baby is coming early and you have to keep them out of this cabin." Another bullet smashed through a cast-iron skillet hanging on the wall, showering them with black shrapnel. Silas blinked, the ghosts retreating behind the fierce, blazing reality of Clara's eyes. His jaw locked. The Ridge Creek ghost vanished, leaving only a husband and a father ready to tear the world apart to protect his own. "The trapdoor," Silas ordered, pointing to a rug near the hearth. "Under the floorboards. Get the boys in the root cellar." Clara crawled back, hauling the heavy rug aside and yanking the iron ring. The trapdoor swung open, revealing a small, dark dugout lined with potatoes and root vegetables. She ushered Liam and Sam down the short ladder. Keep your hands over your ears." She kissed both their heads, her body trembling with a fresh contraction. "I love you. Stay down." She slammed the trap door shut and dragged the rug back over it. Just as she crawled back to Silas, sliding the fully loaded spare rifle into his waiting hand, Thorne's voice echoed over the howling wind. "You're outgunned, Vance," Thorne screamed from the cover of the pines. "Give up the deed, and I'll let the woman and the bastards walk down the mountain." Silas didn't answer with words. He aimed at the muzzle flash of Thorne's voice and fired. A curse echoed through the snow, followed by the frantic scrambling of boots. "He's pinned," Silas grunted, tossing the empty rifle to Clara and taking the loaded one. "But there are 3 more out there, and we're down to half a box of shells." For 20 agonizing minutes they held the line. Clara loaded the weapons, her breath coming in ragged, painful gasps, as her labor accelerated with unnatural, terrifying speed fueled by pure adrenaline. Silas fired with deadly accuracy, keeping Thorne's men pinned behind the tree line, unable to advance across the open clearing. But Thorne was a man driven by greed, and greed made men desperate. "If we can't shoot him out, we burn him out!" Thorne's voice shrieked. Through the shattered window, Silas saw a flicker of orange light deep in the trees. It grew brighter, illuminating the falling snow. One of the hired guns had stripped off his coat, wrapped it around a thick pine branch, and soaked it in kerosene from a saddlebag. A torch. If that torch hit the dry pine needle roof of the cabin, the whole structure would go up in minutes. They would burn alive or be shot down the second they ran out the door. "Clara, get in the cellar with the boys," Silas said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "Silas, no! Do it!" he roared, pulling his heavy Colt revolver from his hip. The rifles were empty. He had 6 bullets left in the handgun. Outside, a man broke from the tree line, sprinting through the knee-deep snow. He held the blazing torch high, his arm winding back to hurl it onto the roof. Silas stood up, completely exposing his chest to the shattered window. He leveled the heavy Colt, his finger tightening on the trigger. He had 1 shot before the man threw the fire. Suddenly, a deafening boom echoed from the ridge above the cabin, a sound far heavier than a standard rifle. It sounded like a buffalo gun. The man with the torch jerked violently forward, his shoulder exploding in a mist of red. The torch fell from his grip, hissing and dying instantly as it hit the deep snowbank. "Federal marshals, drop your weapons!" a voice boomed with the authority of thunder, cutting straight through the blizzard. Silas lowered his Colt, his chest heaving. Through the swirling snow, a dozen men on horseback crested the ridge, their long coats billowing in the wind, rifles raised and trained directly on the tree line. At the front rode a grizzled man with a silver star pinned to his lapel. Thorne's remaining men didn't even try to fight. They threw their rifles into the snow, raising their hands in surrender. Thaddeus Thorne tried to mount his horse to flee, but a marshal spurred his mount forward, slamming the butt of his rifle into Thorne's jaw, knocking the corrupt prospector out cold into the snowdrift. The siege was over. Silas dropped the Colt onto the overturned table. The deafening silence that followed the gunfire was absolute. He turned around, his chest rising and falling rapidly. Clara was lying on the floor near the hearth, her knees pulled up to her chest, her face slick with sweat and twisted in blinding agony. Her hands were clutching the edge of the stone fireplace so tightly her knuckles were bleeding. "Silas," she gasped, her eyes rolling back. "It's time. She's coming right now." The heavy cabin door banged open. The U.S. Marshal stepped inside, his boots tracking snow across the floorboards. He took one look at the overturned table, the shattered windows, and Clara writhing on the floor by the hearth. "Vance?" the Marshal asked, his eyes wide. "We got the trapper's letter. Thorne is in irons. Are you—" "Stand guard outside," Silas cut him off, his voice a low, commanding growl that brooked zero argument. "Do not let anyone in." The Marshal nodded once, backing out and pulling the splintered door firmly shut. Silas didn't freeze. The paralyzing terror that had haunted his nightmares for 8 years evaporated the moment he looked at Clara. He stripped off his heavy canvas duster and tossed his gun belt onto the table. He was no longer a soldier defending a fort. He was a husband bringing life into the world. He moved quickly to the cast-iron stove. The massive pot of water Clara had been boiling for stew was still steaming. Silas grabbed a bar of lye soap, scrubbing his scarred hands and forearms in the scalding water until the skin turned red. He grabbed an armful of clean linen towels from the cedar chest and dropped to his knees on the rug beside her. "I'm here, Clara," Silas murmured, his large hands gently bracketing her face. "Look at me." Clara's eyes fluttered open. She was panting, her body racked by relentless rolling waves of pain. "I can't. Silas, it hurts too much. It's too fast." "You can. You are the strongest woman I have ever known," Silas said, his voice a deep, resonant anchor in the chaotic sea of her pain. He moved down, arranging the linens beneath her, his touch incredibly gentle despite the massive size of his hands. "You saved this family tonight, Clara. Now you just have to bring the rest of it home. Push for me." Clara screamed, a raw, guttural sound that echoed off the heavy cedar logs. She gripped Silas's forearm, her nails biting into his skin, and pushed with every ounce of strength left in her exhausted body. The wind howled outside, a violent contrast to the fierce, quiet focus inside the cabin. Silas didn't flinch. He didn't look away. He guided her through the agony, his voice a steady, rhythmic cadence of praise and instruction. He wiped the sweat from her brow, pressed a cool, damp cloth to her neck, and held her grounded when the pain threatened to pull her under. "Almost there," Silas breathed, his eyes wide with a sudden, brilliant light. "One more, Clara. Give me one more." Clara threw her head back, her throat raw, and gave a final, agonizing push. The tension in the room snapped. A sudden, wet slip, and then, the most beautiful, miraculous sound Silas Vance had ever heard pierced the heavy silence of the cabin. A high, furious, squalling cry. Silas let out a breath that sounded like a sob. He lifted the tiny, writhing infant, his massive, scarred hands cradling the fragile life with terrifying reverence. He moved swiftly, tying and cutting the cord with his sterilized hunting knife, before rapidly rubbing the baby down with a warm, dry towel to clear her lungs. The baby girl wailed louder, her tiny fists boxing the air, her skin a healthy, vibrant pink against the white linen. Silas wrapped her in a thick, soft woolen blanket. His shoulders were shaking, tears streaming freely down his face and disappearing into his dark beard. He turned and gently laid the tightly swaddled bundle onto Clara's chest. Clara let out a breathless, exhausted laugh, pulling the baby close against her beating heart. "She's so small," she whispered, kissing the crown of the infant's dark, damp hair. "She has your lungs," Silas choked out, pressing a kiss to Clara's sweat-drenched forehead. "And your fight." Clara looked up at him, her eyes bright with tears. "We did it." "You did it," Silas corrected gently, resting his forehead against hers. "You gave me my life back." A soft, hesitant knocking came from the floorboards near the hearth. Silas stood up, wiping his face on his sleeve, and pulled the heavy rug aside. He hauled the trapdoor open. Liam and Sam peeked out from the dark root cellar, their eyes wide and frightened. "Is the bad man gone?" Sam whispered. "He's gone, son," Silas said, reaching down and lifting both boys out of the cellar at once. "He's never coming back. Come see what your mother did." He guided the boys to the hearth. Liam and Sam dropped to their knees, staring in absolute awe at the tiny, squalling bundle resting on Clara's chest. "Is it a brother or a sister?" Liam asked, his voice hushed. "A sister," Clara smiled tiredly. "Her name is Daisy." Silas's breath hitched at the name. He looked at Clara, his heart swelling until he thought it might break his ribs. He stepped away for a moment, walking through the connecting door into the cold, bullet-riddled shed. When he returned, he was carrying the heavy oak cradle. He set it gently near the radiant heat of the stove. The carved mustangs and the intricate, sprawling daisies caught the warm, flickering light of the fire. Silas reached down, gently lifting baby Daisy from Clara's exhausted arms. and placed her into the center of the cradle. She stopped crying almost instantly, cocooned in the soft blankets and the smooth, protective wood her father had carved for her. Liam and Sam immediately flanked the cradle, their small hands resting on the oak edge, keeping watch over their new sister. Silas sat down on the edge of the bed beside Clara. He didn't sleep in the barn. He didn't pull away into the shadows. He took her hand, lacing his scarred, calloused fingers through hers, and brought her knuckles to his lips. Outside, the brutal Wyoming blizzard finally broke. The howling wind died down to a soft, whispering breeze. Through the shattered front window of the cabin, the first brilliant, piercing rays of the morning sun crested the jagged peaks of the Medicine Bow Mountains, spilling golden light across the blood-stained floorboards and illuminating the dust dancing in the air. The ghosts of the past were gone, finally laid to rest beneath the snow. In the center of the cabin, surrounded by the fierce, unyielding warmth of a family that had fought through hell to find each other, the oak cradle began to gently rock. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.